When Donald Smith drove Canadian Pacific's last spike in 1885, the city of Vancouver did not yet exist, and Port Moody, the railroad's original terminus, housed only about 250 people. All of British Columbia held about 50,000 residents, half of which were Indigenous peoples who were unlikely to make much use of the railroad, and many of the rest didn't live anywhere near the railroad. The railroad's first problem, then, was to generate enough business to keep its engines lubricated. One way of doing so was to open up trade with the Far East, so that the railroad could become a transportation link between Europe and Asia. To promote this link, Canadian Pacific leased 3 ships that had been built in 1870 for the Cunard Line. These ships were obsolete in Atlantic service, but were better than anything that had been seen before between Canada and Japan. CP put them to work between Vancouver and Yokohama. 2 of these ships, the Abyssinia and Parthia, were about 360 feet in length, and originally accommodated 200 passengers in first class and 1,050 in steerage. They were probably reconfigured for CP service. But steerage was important in the early years of ocean liners, as immigrants made up 90% of North American steamship passengers and generated half of ocean liner revenues. The third ship, the Batavia, was smaller, about 327 feet long, and presumably carried a proportionately smaller number of passengers. CP also contracted out to an import company, Adamson Bell, to manage the ship operations. The ships were successful enough that Canadian Pacific ordered its own fleet of steamships that were larger, faster, and more luxurious, and had plenty of room in cargo holds for high-valued imports, such as tea and silk. These were the first empresses: the Empress of China, Empress of India, and Empress of Japan, while the ex-Cunard ships trundled along at 12.5 knots. The Empresses cruised at 16. India started its maiden voyage on February 8, 1891, while Japan followed on April 11 and China on July 15. In 1903, Canadian Pacific entered the Atlantic market by buying the Beaver Line, which operated several ships in the Quebec-Liverpool route. These included the 446-foot-long Lake Champlain, sister ship Lake Erie, 470-foot Lake Manitoba, and its sister ship Lake Michigan. CP soon ordered its own ships for Atlantic service, the Empress of Britain and Empress of Ireland, for this route. At 570 feet long with capacities of more than 1,500 passengers, these were much larger than anything it had previously owned and could cruise at 18 knots. Britain began its maiden voyage on May 5, 1906, and Ireland on June 29 of the same year. At the same time, CP reconfigured the Lake Series steamships to replace their first and second-class cabins with cabin class. All cabins were the same class, which was really second class. CP also called this monoclass, even though the ships also had a third class, meaning shared cabins. In later years, this third class was sometimes called tourist class. In 1911, the Empress of China, running in thick fog, struck a rock in Tokyo Bay. All passengers and cargo were rescued, but the ship ended up being scrapped. In response, Canadian Pacific ordered 2 new Pacific Empresses, the Empress of Asia and Empress of Russia. Russia started its maiden voyage on April 1, 1913, and Asia shortly after. These ships could run at 19 knots, and were approximately the same dimensions as the Britain and Ireland, but configured to carry 1,100 to 1,200 passengers. A more serious tragedy took place on May 29, 1914, when the Empress of Ireland collided with a Norwegian cargo ship in the St. Lawrence River. The Empress sank in just 14 minutes, allowing little time to lower lifeboats. More than 1,000 lives were lost, making this the biggest maritime disaster in Canadian history.